Pompeo's visit to Africa follows visits by German Chancellor Angela Merkel and China's Wang. Witney Schneidman, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and Senior International Advisor at Covington and Burlington, joins us here in the studio to talk more about the expectations. So I guess plain and simple, what do you think Secretary Pompeo's goals are in the continent? Consider that a lot of nations just simply haven't reacted well to the cold shoulder by the Trump administration.
Right. Well, I think ideally Secretary Pompeo would like to see a lot more U.S. investment coming into Africa. He would like to see American companies investing in infrastructure and telecom and ports and consumer products. But there's a big hurdle there. Americans don't really understand Africa that well. We see it as a continent of risk as opposed to the great continent of opportunity that it really is. And so Secretary Pompeo has a challenge just to explain what the market opportunity is in Africa. And that's based on, what this administration is trying to do.
Then why hasn't the Trump administration sent a high-ranking official there sooner? And secondly, there have been complaints that the U.S. doesn't really even have a clear policy on the continent.
Well, we don't really have a clear policy. I mean, it was 14 months ago that then National Security Advisor John Bolton rolled out the Trump Africa policy. But he really framed it as a great power competition, that the U.S. is locked in a competition with China and the Soviet Union in Africa, and that our response was going to be a program called Prosper Africa. And it's really not the right approach to the continent. For the U.S. to have an effective policy, we need our State Department, we need our Defense Department, we need our Commerce Department working together hand in hand. We need our top leadership of our government saying Africa is a priority for the United States. And unfortunately, we just haven't seen that.
Yeah. And interesting you say that, because if you think about the DOD and Homeland Security in the U.S., Nigeria certainly has been a partner with the United States fighting terrorism in that region. Yet earlier in the program, we talked about the travel ban from people coming from Nigeria and visas not being doled out. How do you rationalize those two mixed messages?
Well, I think this is Pompeo's challenge. How does he explain the contradictory messages coming from Washington? On the one hand, he wants to increase trade and investment, but on the other hand, we're putting travel bans on not just Nigeria, but Tanzania, Sudan, and Eritrea. And I think when Americans hear about travel bans on African countries, they just think travel bans on Africa. And that just makes the job of selling the opportunity in the African market to American businesses even more difficult.
Yeah, sadly, I know a lot of people that think the continent is one nation. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. But let's talk about Wang. His first overseas trip this year was to the continent of Africa, really showing the importance he puts on the diplomatic relations there. Let's talk about the Trump administration. Clearly, a lot of nations there are still stinging from that comment when he referred to the countries as less than desirable nations. I'm not going to say it, but I think everybody knows what we're talking about. How does he move past that?
I don't think he has moved past that. I mean, I think Secretary Pompeo's trip is a good start, but the question is it a one-off? What happens after this? We're hearing noises from the administration that there might be an investment summit of 40 of all African heads of state later this year, but it's just a rumor. Is that going to happen? So I think the challenge to Secretary Pompeo is, how is this trip going to be followed up? What happens next? Will there be a meeting of foreign ministers in Washington? Will there be a meeting of defense ministers to discuss the security relationship? Because DOD has said they're going to draw down there as well. So I think there are a lot of questions about the U.S.-African relationship and not many answers.
Well, not a lot of time left here, but I want to talk about what China's doing there. Bridges, roads, hospitals, water projects, the EU investing, other African nations investing heavily in the continent as well. But let's talk about the EU. Where do you see it going in the future?
So the EU has a very sophisticated trade relationship with Africa. They have something called economic partnership agreements, which creates multi-favored nation status, which gives EU companies, goods, and services a tariff advantage going into the African market. That's a challenge for the United States.
Absolutely.
Because a refrigerator produced in Indiana has an 18% tariff going into the South African market. That same refrigerator coming from Frankfurt comes in at 2%. So that's part of the complexity that we have to address.
Witney, a lot of catch up to do. It's going to be curious to see how this moves forward.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your insight. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.